right now. And today we really want to look at those issues from a couple of different lenses. We want to know how the faculty is thinking about these issues, how alumni are thinking about this in the workforce, and of course, how students are thinking about these issues today. Our goal is to discuss widely on these issues, but to start with, we want to recognize that today marks the first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation in Canada, a federal statutory holiday that honors the lost children and survivors of residential schools, their families and communities. It's also Orange Shirt Day, which some of you may know about and some of you may not, but either way, it's nice just to sort of remember what it's about. So this is an Indigenous-led grassroots and commemorative day that relates to the experience of Phyllis Webstad. She was from the Squamish First Nation, and at 6 years old, showed up for her first day at her mission school, proudly wearing a brand new shirt bought for her by her grandmother and was taken away from her. It's now a symbol of the stripping away of culture, freedom, and self-esteem experienced by Indigenous children over generations. So we're thankful for joining together on this day in particular. Let me start by introducing myself. I'm Alex Conliffe, and I studied mechanical engineering at McGill between years of 1999 and 2004. I was thinking about this panel and a little bit about my time at McGill. And in my last year, actually, the mechanical engineering department welcomed its first woman faculty member, Professor Scharf, who's still with the faculty in the department now, and who I had the privilege of taking system dynamics with. And I was reflecting on how important that was as part of my time at McGill, and actually pulled out the textbook, sticky notes. I was a good student that I keep still on my bookshelf today. So I thought that that was kind of just a nice way of thinking about these topics and saying something a little bit about my time at McGill. I now work for the McCall Foundation, where I lead our philanthropy across education and scholarships, climate change, youth, mental health, and well-being. But one of my greatest privileges over the last couple of years has actually been participating on the Faculty Advancement Board for Engineering, which works closely with Dean Jim Nicell to steward a number of initiatives that I think are having a really big impact on the student experience at McGill. You may know of some of them. They include Engine, which is focused on entrepreneurship, Empower, which really focuses on building leaders who are equipped to tackle global challenges, Elate, which is focused on teaching, and our topic for today, EIDEA, which stands for Engineering Inclusivity, Diversity, and Equity Advancement. So what we're going to do is hear a little bit about what EIDEA is all about. We'll hear from Professor Chromik, Richard on that, and then we'll kind of start a little bit of a conversation and bring in Jackie and Aleph. As we go, we'd love for you to ask questions. To kind of help in that regard, Cynthia Liu is going to kind of receive questions. So feel free to chat them to her in the box and she'll kind of curate so that we can kind of keep a conversation style going and not get too caught between what's going on in the chat and the conversation that we're hoping to have here. So I'm first going to introduce you to Richard here a little bit, and then we'll move into the conversation. So Richard is the outgoing Associate Dean of EIDEA and the current Department Chair of Mining and Materials Engineering. His background is in physics and chemical physics, and I of course could go on about his research, but I think most relevant to this conversation it would be the significant time that he has devoted to the practice of teaching and of incorporating equity and inclusion into the classroom, including through funded work on equity and teamwork in project-based learning in engineering. So without further ado, Richard, can you introduce us to EIDEA and tell us why the faculty decided to create it and what are its key goals?
Sure. Thanks, Alex, for that introduction. And Thanks everyone for being here. Welcome to this event. A disclaimer, I was not there at the time that eIDEA was created, but my understanding is that it's a little over 5 years old in terms of being one of those three or four e-initiatives that you listed off. My impression is that it was, at the time it was created, it was when there was a lot of research coming out showing that when you have diverse teams, it can lead to better decision making that's more inclusive and in many cases even more innovative. The other thing that was happening in our faculty at the time is there was already a sustained push for better gender balance in our faculty. And there was an increased awareness and commitment to helping a lot of the other underrepresented groups in the discipline of engineering to take advantage of education in our faculty. And I guess the other things I'd like to mention regarding is because engineering is traditionally very non-diverse field, we had to go for sort of a multi-tiered approach to address EDI within our faculty. So I'll be talking today during the panel about initiatives that address equity for faculty, staff, and students. Just briefly, we looked at equitable hiring practices that were implemented quite a long time ago and still persist, looking at issues of representation in our faculty, training on EDI at all levels. And really the overall objective of eIDEA is to create an on-campus environment that's inclusive and equitable so that as we become a more diverse faculty and the discipline of engineering becomes more diverse, that everyone has, feels that they're welcome, part of our community, and have the best opportunity to thrive.
Great. Okay, so we'll look forward to learning a little bit more about it as we go. Let me introduce Jackie and Alif. So Jackie is an alum, having graduated from McGill in 1987 with a bachelor's in chemical engineering. She comes to this conversation with a wealth of experience, currently as the principal of Side People Consulting, LLC, which provides leadership and business advising to nonprofit and tech companies with a strong focus on helping next generation women leaders. Prior, Jackie spent 22 years at Lam Research, a semiconductor capital equipment manufacturer. During her tenure there, she led research, product development, marketing, and product operations for many groups, including the Clean Product Group, Reliant Products, and emerging businesses. In 2010, she founded the Technical Women's Group at Lam to help women better navigate their careers and be successful in traditionally male roles. She serves on the board of directors for Ultra Clean Technology. Alif Kirksu is a candidate for the B.Sc Architecture. And is it your fourth year that you've just started? Yes.
Yes, it's my fourth year.
Perfect, I got that right. She has engaged steadily in student government since starting at McGill, including as the engineering representative at SMU, which we hopefully all remember, Student Society at McGill University. Maybe this is one place where acronyms are okay. And is the Commissioner for Equity at the EUS, the Engineering Undergraduate Society, and a member of the EUS Board of Governors. She's also served in numerous roles over the years on the Architecture Students Association, including most recently as its president. So this is who we have in conversation with us today. And Jackie, why don't we get started with you? And on the kind of issue of intergenerationality. So more engineers are working past the age of retirement than ever before at the same time as new graduates are entering into the workforce, meaning that it's the first time in history that companies need to manage 5 different generations all at once. Why is it important for engineers to understand the generational differences in the workplace?
Thank you, Alex. It's important. I want to echo some of what Richard said. I think it's really important to embrace the multi-generational and any sort of diversity, because what you get with that is a diversity of ideas, a diversity of approach, a diversity of experience. And what that does is it improves an organization's innovation, as Richard said. It improves expands the amount of ideas you get. It also improves critical thinking and problem solving. And all of that usually leads to more innovation and better decision making. And more innovation, better decision-making will most likely lead to better business results. So it's really important for that. Specific to just the age, when you have such a large age, you have an incredibly different approach to working, approach to balance of life. And that's interesting. Like oftentimes you'll think the older generations will be teaching the younger generations. And while that's true and that's necessary, what I also found is the younger generation teaches the older generation. The younger generation is usually much better with technology and will bring in technology into the workplace that might make the group more efficient. The younger generation comes in with less fixation on hierarchy. I remember when I brought in a new college grad into a group of engineers that were all in their 40s, 50s, and 60s. And so all of my engineers were above 40, and then I bring in one 22-year-old. And the first thing he did was cut through the hierarchy. He was constantly walking into my office and talking to me when the older engineers were afraid to do that. So it changed the whole dynamics and the amount of communication across the entire department just by bringing in one younger person. So there's benefits in both ways by having this large group or bandwidth of ages in your organization.
When we think about the old stereotype of what an engineer might look like, it is changing, it's evolving. And I was looking at some Engineers Canada data just as a bit of a refresher yesterday on one dimension that we've mentioned already, on gender. And I looked, and when Jackie, you studied at McGill, women would have represented less than 15% of engineering undergraduates across Canada. When I studied, actually gone up nicely. It was up to about 20%, then depressingly went down for a while, and now it's kind of climbing a little bit. And at McGill, you know, it now comprises 30% plus women. There's other changes, growth, for example, in international students, which now represent about a third of the students. And so my question is back to Richard. To tell us a little bit about what the faculty has done to support the growth of diversity and to set up its students for success.
Thanks, Alex. So one thing I'd like to mention is the 30% number is significant because Engineers Canada has identified that as a goal of trying to have 30% of new licensed engineers to be female by the year 2030. So having 30% within our student body is a great start, but we're still pushing to get that number even higher. One of the things that we're doing on campus to try to help students with EDI is what's called the Teamwork Project. So it's a project that's been funded for 3 years by an agency called Entente Canada Quebec. And the goal of that project is to provide EDI training in the context of a technical project that the students are undertaking. So we're kind of trying to simulate this diverse team that they'll face in the workplace where they're doing a technical project in one of their courses. So there's a opportunity at the beginning of the course to get some training on implicit bias and active listening and things like that. And then depending on how deep we go in each individual course that we've targeted for this, there can be some follow-up of coaching of how to deal with conflict and things like that, because I think we all realize that there's these great benefits that we've mentioned for diverse teams, but there can also be significant challenges when these people are working in teams. All told, we've partnered with about 12 courses across all the engineering departments, and we're at a stage right now, entering our 3rd year, that this agency that we've gotten this funding from typically only funds about 3 years. So we're looking for opportunities to extend this and continue this work, because there's still plenty to do. And we need to make this sort of work sustainable to have the best impact for all of our students. Some other things I can mention that we're up to try and support students on campus from different backgrounds is that EIDEA typically, with whatever funding we've gotten through philanthropy or corporate donations, we're essentially funneling that money to student groups that are doing EDI work. So we have the American Indian Science and Engineering Society, the Canadian branch that's at McGill, the McGill chapter that we funded many times, POW, Equity EUS, and the Graduate Engineering Equity Committee doing equity initiatives. And that kind of dropped off quite a bit during the pandemic, because usually what we're funding them to do is go off to equity conferences and things like that, or do things on campus that are usually in person. But there were still activities over the past year of online events, Zoom things for students doing equity work. And I guess the last thing I'll mention just briefly, which I think I'll touch on a little bit later, is that we still are trying to make an effort for representation, because as you mentioned, Alex, you know, the impact that you had with Ina Sharf being your professor is we feel that, you know, the pipeline has to eventually flow to the professors as well. So it starts with students, diversifying the student body and training these students, but eventually we have to have good representation within our faculty too, so that they have good role models and mentors to look up to, people that look like them and are familiar to them, that they can talk to about their specific challenges.
Super. And let's definitely come back to that in a little while. I really do love this, really thinking through around some of the teaching and the project-based research out there certainly says that those team dynamics start early on. And so if you kind of get delegated as the note taker versus the person who's really doing the substance in that, the engineering work, you sort of typecast and you take that with you into the workplace. And I believe this has been cited as one of the reasons why people end up leaving, because they stay in those roles and they're not fulfilling. And so kind of correcting for that and recognizing that early on it is really critical. Ayla, let's turn to you for a student perspective. Can you talk to us from your perspective about why representation is important?
Yes, sure. So, well, in today's world and in our workspaces as well, like representation allows us to basically, it breaks down these stereotypes while promoting more openness and like removing unconscious biases of limitations that some people might have. We tend to like accept these biases because of how we have been exposed to them throughout our lives, from like gender roles to issues that minorities face. It also allows us to understand or see, if not fully empathize with what other people in our community are exposed to. So I have been personally involved with EUS equity for I think 3 years now. And like, even though in the realm of like extensive experience, it may be a short amount of time, I've got to learn the importance of representations in our community in like EUS engineering context, and our profession through the experiences some students have faced in the past. And there's no statement as representation solves everything, but it definitely is like a necessary step in the general idea of providing equity in our spaces. So it can like change how minorities are viewed and how they view themselves. We all bring different perspectives to the table, and these are all informed by our identities and experiences, basically. It may even be appropriate to say that due to the lack of representation maybe in the past, people suffer the consequences today. There are some students that still come to EUS equity or like other forms of student bodies, and they don't feel represented enough in classrooms and other places, which is why like as EUS equity, we're trying to like diversify our portfolios as well. So yes, there needs to be like an extra step taking in this direction.
Maybe you can talk to us a little bit about, kind of difference between equity, equality, and really what this role, like I'm sure I'm curious, I'm sure others are, really about what this role in this moment, this EUS equity commissioner and the committee, what is the role, and a little more tangibly how it helps to create a safer environment in the faculty.
Mm-hmm. So I'm not going to go into the 90% seen infographic of equity and equality. with the boxes and fences infographic, because I personally do not resonate with it. Hence, like, I'm not going to give it as an example. But to summarize it for the sake of like the discussion, it is like, for me, it is not a good representation because equity is not implemented through theories. You cannot simply give boxes just enough to let them like see or experience the same things basically, or to overcome obstacles. So because not everyone will require these boxes in order to be treated in equality, and because there will still be a barrier. So what equity deems to do is removing the fence or the barrier itself and not going over them and leave them for the next unfortunate group. In a dictionary term, equity, basically it recognizes each person that has different circumstances, and your solution cannot be a prefabricated solution. Equality, however, means everyone is given basically the same amount of resources and let the group use it however they want. So in theory, equality is the basic good thing we learn from a young age, but as we get older, we realize it is not that, like, it does not do much in practice because it needs to be like an equitable portfolio to start from. So this also ties back to the systematic biases we accept as societies. We don't necessarily think something is deemed necessary because like we never suffer from its absence. So EOS Equity, or like Equity Commissioner, tries to go over the systematic inequity in the community and addresses it first. The committee aims to remove systematic barriers, provide resources in conjunction with the faculty, while providing sessions to inform students. So we do roundtables, we do workshops with the general students, as well as the community's various branches. So EOS, as many of you may have like experience, it has a lot of clubs, committees, and design teams. So in order to address what's embedded problem, we do these roundtables with these committees or design teams and create a safer space within the faculty while also providing workshops and basically a no judgment free zone for like talking and discussion.
This definitely sounds like an evolved system and infrastructure that's available to students as compared to when I was going through engineering. As a reminder, I'm going to keep asking questions, and Richard, I'm going to come back to the one that we had sort of flagged so that we don't forget it. But I do want to remind those who are on the line that we would also love to hear from you. And so please feel free to reach out to Cynthia and share your questions so that we can address those as they come. But Richard, as I said, let's then talk about faculty members and as we've said, who you're taught by, who you see in the faculty does have an impression if you see yourself reflected. So maybe you can tell us a little bit then on the faculty side, what's being done to diversify staff, but also to train staff on the subject of equity, diversity, and inclusion.
Sure, thanks, Alex. So the first thing I would mention is that we're still working to increase representation for women in our faculty. I checked the stats before I signed on to the Zoom just to see where we're at. And so we're now at 22% for women faculty in our Faculty of Engineering. That might initially sound embarrassingly low, but if we think about the stats that were given at the beginning about students within our faculty, it's similar. About 5 years ago, it was sitting around 17%, and we continue to try to push to have better representation from women faculty. This has largely been successful just simply by changing hiring practices in a very small way, a few small ways. First being that all of our search committees have equity-based training on implicit bias, so that they know how to apply those principles when they're looking at candidates for our search committees. And also we have simple rules that essentially they have to shortlist at least one candidate from one of these underrepresented groups, because we firmly believe that in any search process, we're going to get at least one, if not, many more, if not dozens of highly qualified people from the groups that we're hoping to hire from, including Indigenous and Black engineers, architects, and urban planners. And then once people get here, of course, whatever their background be, we'd like them to embrace equity, inclusivity, and diversity when they get here. So we give a workshop for new hires when they first arrive. Actually, we give a day-long training orientation session that is quite exhausting for many of our well, not necessarily for the new professors, but maybe for the associate deans that give the training. And they get a portion of that as equity training. So we usually partner with the central equity team at McGill to give those trainings and give them just sort of a taste. And then there's plenty of opportunities for them to follow up with other workshops as well. Another thing I would mention, and this is not necessarily driven by McGill, although we certainly embrace it and we encourage, and we're giving resources to our professors for it, is that the main funding agency, NSERC, that our professors get their funding from, requires that professors describe how they're using an EDI lens with their research teams. So it really requires that the professors have some sort of a recruitment process for their research groups that is equitable, and that when people get here, that they lead an inclusive research team. And then I think the last thing to answer this question would be the Equity Ambassador Program. So this was a program that was launched early on in the history of the idea, where essentially it was a way to get people interested in equity to just get past that initial barrier to get that first training. So that's what it was like at the start. So to become an equity ambassador, people would have to have active listening training, implicit bias training, and then at least one or two other equity-based workshop trainings that they've taken either at McGill or elsewhere. So those people, whether they be professors or staff, essentially become part of this ambassador program, where they're kind of like go-to people within their own unit within the faculty, where if someone else that's not necessarily had equity training yet, is not as knowledgeable about these topics, can go to these people to ask for advice, where to find information, or perhaps, encourage them to rise up and also become an equity ambassador as well. So there's a lot of activity to address these sorts of things, but we continue to push forward as well, because it's certainly, I think there's upwards of about 160 professors in our faculty now, and there's still quite a few people that we'd like to bring in to get some of this training.
And can you tell us a little bit then about the progress made specifically towards increasing the number of Black and Indigenous students, maybe also faculty and staff as well?
Sure. So there's a few things. There's a recently created Indigenous and Black Engineering Technology Fellowship. So this is for Indigenous and Black students that want to pursue a PhD. And it's essentially a four-year scholarship that can be that's been created for them, where we can give 2 of these away per year. Another thing that occurred recently to support Indigenous students was that we had a gift from Suncor that was repurposed to support Indigenous engineering students. So the sorts of things that this gift will support are entrance scholarships, support for internships that they might do, where they might be traveling back to their home, and they need travel expenses for this. Financial support for other on-campus outreach events, things like that, supporting CASIS and the Indigenous students that are on campus. The other thing is licenses, simply put it. So a license is what we get when we want to hire a new professor. And I think everybody knows that the university created a call for addressing anti-Black racism, addressing Indigenous issues. So there's been a number of hiring licenses that have been created, and we've applied for a few of these in the School of Architecture, and those searches are ongoing. And lastly, the other thing that I can mention, and this is largely led by the same person that runs the Teamwork Project, Faye Sillick, is the outreach activities that we do. So we had a NSERC Promo Science grant for 3 years, where Faye worked with the Ganawage Survival School. The efforts with that school are currently on pause because of the pandemic. So right now, for the next year and hopefully the next 3 years, as we just applied for more funding. She's working with Burling Academy, where there's some underrepresented groups there, smaller population of Indigenous students, but some Black students and other students. I should mention, when we do outreach activities, we're really doing sort of the core STEM sort of activities and just trying to encourage students from any background to get interested in science and engineering, in the hopes that we just increase the population of Indigenous, Black students, female students that actually apply to university. So if they apply to McGill, that's great, but we're not really, you know, pushing them to come to McGill. We just want them to go to university, go to college, and pursue something if we've actually sparked their interest anywhere, hopefully in Canada.
Okay. Jackie, I might just hand over to you to say, in terms of some of those kind of like tactics and changes in hiring, and of course in the workplace, you're not hiring faculty and, you know, you're hiring into the workplace, but does some of that sound familiar? Would you add anything in terms of what it looks like to think about and to recruit a diverse workforce?
Yeah, it's hard to recruit a diverse workforce if you don't have a diverse workforce in the first place. When you bring someone who's a different race, a different color, a different gender into a work, and they see as they're interviewing that there's all white men, they're not going to necessarily be interested. So starting that recruiting is hard. For the people that are hiring, it's hard to get, especially with engineers who are hiring engineers. They want to hire like. If you have a mechanical engineering manager who's hiring, he has in his mind what the optimal mechanical engineer is, and it's usually somebody like him. And so you have to kind of do a lot of training, as Richard was saying, to get people to remove biases. I think it was Harvard that did a study that showed a resume to a ton of people and said, what do you think of this person? And with half the participants, they showed the same resume, but they had it as a male name for half the participants and a female name for the other half. And without exception, when it was a male, there were all these accolades, and with the female, there was a bunch of doubts. So, anything you can do to remove somebody knowing what's the difference in how someone looks or gender in the hiring process, like get it as far as you can before you really know, what that person looks like, I think really helps. But also trying to do a lot of, as Richard was saying, unconscious bias training, trying to get people to think and remove their biases. And you can do that by having conversations just before they talk to candidates, having conversations that make them think a little bit differently. And if you do that just before they talk to candidates, there's a lot of studies that show they'll go into these interviews with a much more open mind.
Adolf, I'm going to turn to you because it's a little bit related, and then I do see a hand, so I am going to come to it. But I thought it might be interesting to ask you, what are students' expectations about entering the workplace in terms of training, support, so forth?
Yes. So I think while the generational gap is one of the most evident problems, as Jackie was talking about, when we talk or in person, when we just say, yes, there's 5 generational gap right now in the workforce, which is one of the biggest problems in with the representation and everything. I feel it is also cultural. So it is the feedback that you would get from your supervisors, or the relationship that students have now with their colleagues, in contrast to their peers in university. And one of the biggest thing is mentorship. So for most students, they require relationships when they get into the workspace, but because of the mentioned differences in ideas and representation, even though there's an ongoing work to kind of break that kind of a barrier, students tend to still be hesitant about to seek support at least, or complete their trainings efficiently. Throughout the surveys that we use in EUS Equity, I feel that was one of the most evident ones that students have said that they're facing throughout their summer internships or their co-ops.
All right, I said that we would come to a hand, so I think Jean, you had a question.
Yes, thanks, Alex. And thanks for everybody. I think this is one of my most passionate topics. School of Architecture, like 1998. I think I applaud the conversation you're having about sort of looking forward and diversifying staff and sort of anything that's happening sort of from today going forward. My biggest concern is also keeping in mind the things that are already in place. 20 years ago when I was at McGill, there was being gay wasn't the thing, you know, people wouldn't talk about it. I didn't see myself on TV. I didn't see myself anywhere. And the last thing I felt comfortable doing in the School of Architecture was coming out to my professors because I didn't feel like it was a safe environment. There's professors that I had 20 years ago that are still there, and when I had them, I already thought they were kind of old. Not to say that they're not fantastic people, but it wasn't an environment that I felt comfortable in. There was homophobia in the school, there was misogyny in the school. What is, like you've talked about, bringing diversity in terms of staff so that students recognize themselves. I still am an invisible minority. I don't walk around with a rainbow sticker on my forehead, and I don't expect professors to do the same. So how do you address sort of the recognition that LGBTQ students need to feel when they're in school without prying into private lives of either professors or staff that may or may not feel comfortable, you know, being out to their students? But how do you also train, you know, professors that, like I said, that I had 20 years ago? How do you train them in EDI? What are you providing for that? And how is the curriculum changing so that architecture does speak to people, architects of color, LGBTQ architects, and the history behind LGBTQ and its impact on architecture? You know, Black and brown architects and their impact on architecture, not just, you know, the Piranesi's of the world and sort of the very patriarchic, cisgendered white architect history. And thank you for letting me ask the question.
Richard, do you want to start us off, and then, you know, if you might have things to add from student perspective, Jackie?
I can say a few words. I would have to say that in my time as associate dean, that the School of Architecture was actually one of the most active on these particular topics. So there's a lot of passionate people within the school at this time, looking for the type of change that was just mentioned. So I think that that's good news for John, is that his school is embracing a lot of these ideas. In terms of these non-binary gender issues, I guess is what I would call it, LGBTQ. We do give that in our trainings. So when we do EDI trainings, there are discussions about these things. But a lot of times it's, as you mentioned, it's difficult to have staff come forward. So this idea that we were just talking about earlier about having role models, having representation, I find it's more difficult, I think, in some sense. And we do take data that's confidential when we hire people into professor positions. So people can, in an equity survey, check a box and identify as LGBTQ. And then they're identified as an underrepresented candidate that may end up being shortlisted. So we may be able to increase representation of these people, but then it just becomes a question of, are they comfortable when they get here actually coming forward and being an advocate or a representative that can help students that are in those positions. I would mention that there is queer engineers, so there is a student group on this topic. So it's not like I think things have gotten better from that perspective, but I can't speak to the student experience. So I think I would have to leave that for Elif to maybe comment on.
Can I continue? Okay. Yeah, thank you for the question. Actually, the first thing would be like to talk about the queer engineer. It is a EUS group or like a club at McGill that basically they provide a safe and welcoming environment for gender and sexual minorities. It was initially started as like an engineering, like within the faculty of engineering, but now they have become like a SMU club, so they do get participants from every faculty. And basically with what queer engineer does, with at least with EUS equity, or like with myself personally, at the end of each year before we do our like our layout for the trainings, etc., we consult the Queer Engineer Society of Black Engineers, and I believe like some more most like minority groups within EUS to have feedback on like what was lacking from those workshops and what they want to be like what they want to see. So that is kind of the contribution for like EUS equity. Like aside from EUS equity, because I also am a student at the School of Architecture, I'm also a working member of the anti-racism working group, as well as I work with professors on eradicating basically homophobia or any kind of like any kind of discrimination against any minorities, really. That's the way that I would put it. And there has been ongoing like works and researches going on about that as well. But I believe the representation, like at least from the student side, the representation within the Faculty of Engineering is now it's in a better state than it was probably in 20 years. Maybe it's like also something, maybe like I don't really know the struggle of like 20 years, but as far as I know, yes, there's like still some homophobia or any kind of discrimination that needs to be like eradicated within our society. But I feel like people have started to express themselves more freely, and EUS allows this kind of a free space or safe space for its students.
If I could jump in, this is Cynthia. So I work with the Faculty of Engineering Advancement Board. I think I need a spotlight myself. Jean, I recently worked with queer engineers just before the pandemic, so not so much recently, about 2 years ago. And it was to put on a networking panel to talk about how does your identity affect how people start entrepreneurship, apply for grants, how does that affect their success and abilities towards creating new businesses. And I know that about 40 students showed up. So there is a demand for that kind of content and that kind of support. We had a great panel of professionals who both identified as LGBTQ+ and others who consider themselves allies. And in terms of safety, where you were saying, how do we give that support without prying to people's personal lives? I know that Queer Engineer, they're very good with making sure that photos are not posted without consent in case someone who is there who is not comfortable having that information public. They're very good with that, about making sure that everyone feels welcome there without the assumption of why someone is attending. So I do think, as Elif said, that there is a general safe environment that is provided. And obviously, if you have more feedback, that would be great. And we can take that conversation further.
Thanks for the question, Jean. It's really nice just to hear these perspectives coming from different parts of the faculty on the issue. Jackie, I might just ask you to kind of weigh in terms of how this might also resonate. It comes from a different variety of these angles. We started with intergenerationality, which is sort of part of this in the workplace, and you know, making a place that's safe, comfortable, welcoming for all. So do you want to add anything from a workplace perspective?
I think it's still, at least in the industry I'm in, which is semiconductor industry, it's still definitely a problem. And listening to Jean what I started thinking is, the big issue is you can't bring your whole self to the company. As a woman, you can't bring your whole self to the company until there's more diversity in the company or in the industry. So it'll be a problem. But I do think that it's one of the best parts about intergenerationality, where you're having so many different generations in the same place. The younger generations are bringing this more openness, which is then enabling the older generations to come out as who they truly are. So that's one thing I think that is happening. The other thing that's happening is with the trend towards ESG, environmental, social, and governance pushes to corporations that are coming through the investors and coming through the employees. More and more companies are making sure that they have programs in place to make sure that it is a safe environment. There's removing some of the bias in the environment. And that's being pushed directly from investors. It's being pushed in the board level. As a board member, you have to have a diverse board, and that's diverse in all ways. And then that's pushing the culture down into the corporations as well. So I don't think we're anywhere near where we need to be, but I think that there is a start.
I think that's probably these issues, it sums it up really well in terms of where we're at as society, and then unsurprisingly in our kind of working and learning environments. I might just pose a question. It's the same question, and I'll go to each of you, and then Richard, I'd like to come back to you a little bit about the future of EIDEA. But Jackie, I'll start with you and just ask you, maybe as you sort of look at EDI and the goals that you have and that you're kind of pushing for, maybe you could share with us what's kind of a next goal or two that you're really focused on, the next kind of ceiling that you're hoping you can kind of help to break. And then Elif, I'll ask you the same thing from a student perspective or EUS perspective.
Yeah, I think that the one that what's overlooked in EDI is the inclusion part. You can change the metrics by hiring a more diverse workforce. You can, make it more equitable, where people have the same level of opportunities, where people have the same pay for the same job, which is something that we're still trying to establish in many of the corporate worlds. But if you hire a diverse workforce and they don't feel included, then you're going to lose them. And I see a lot of corporations forgetting about that inclusion. So one of the interesting things that happened in recent years is, for example, the Me Too generation and the Me Too movement was really great at bringing out all of these, the sexual harassment that exists in corporations and in many situations. But then it also created this barrier. Like, I've heard some people in my industry say, well, I won't even go out to lunch with a woman. Men, I won't go out to lunch with a woman anymore, because they're worried about what this means for the Me Too. You have to enable this a diverse workforce, but you also have to put things in place to help break down the barriers that are preventing the inclusion. And so that's what I think is the next big push, is how do we get the inclusion?
Great. Elif, maybe I'm giving you an EUS hat, but a student hat you can share, and just let us know, what do you think is the next kind of ceiling goal to sort of start pushing through?
Mm-hmm. I believe one of the biggest thing that is we tried starting the whole movement to break this barrier, but it was for EUS side or any kind of student body side, I would say it would be similar to Jackie's. It's the diversity. So in many of the student bodies, in many of the executive positions within EUS or within every departmental society, it's from my understanding, it was mostly people who know, or people from similar backgrounds in the past, and that's what EUS has been trying to eradicate. So we have been trying to diversify, for example, the board of governors, which is the highest body in EUS that oversees the financial and legal liability, or diversifying the equity portfolio, or diversifying departmental societies' equity representatives. So these are kind of the steps that we've taken in the past, and while I do appreciate like the start point, I feel like there's still like so much to go from and so much to do, because there are still some students that feel underrepresented. And that is one of the problems that we like need to face in order to like, if we want to implement fully the safest space that we deem to have.
It's humbling work. I think we need to stay humble and keep learning. That's a big part of the process as well. So Richard, maybe we could sort of close out with you. I'm conscious of time, and you know, eIdea, it's a terrific initiative. This did not exist previously. We do need these dedicated pushes. We need to keep learning from them. We need to keep evolving them. And so it's sort of terrific to get this kind of point in time, but maybe you could share with us, you know, what are some of the plans for the future? And for those of us who want to contribute, you know, how can we help out?
Oh, there's many ways to help out. But I could go back to what I said at the beginning, which is that eIdea is actually the youngest of those e-initiatives within the faculty. So we're still having a lot of growing pains. And here's the cat finally. So essentially what that means is that a large portion of our money comes from donations, whether they be alumni or corporate donations. So everything that I talked about to you already, or I'd say a large portion of it comes through philanthropy. And then a lot of the other ones, we actually have to go out and get soft funding from different government agencies. And really having additional core support through philanthropy is going to be very helpful for eIdea, because we really have this core mission to make our faculty more inclusive. And to really do that in the same way that we've done for the other e-initiatives, we really need a manager in place for the eIdea that can sort of run the day-to-day business of promoting equity within our faculty. And then a lot of these other things that we've talked about, we can sort of be like, I shouldn't say it this way, but sort of like the decorations on the cake. You know, like when we want to go out and do some additional work on outreach, we can apply for another grant. But we already have outreach core within eIdea because we have a certain body of funding that helps us to do all of this work. It hurts me to say this because I mean, everybody that's here is probably here because they're really excited about EDI and they think that we should be championing, and it's really come to the forefront in our society these days. But it's also the truth that getting funding for all the really cool things is often difficult. You know, you have to chase funding for these sorts of things to actually make these things become a reality. So really all the activities that I mentioned are things that we want to continue. We want to continue to have a good outreach presence in the Ganawage school and other schools in the area that with their students that are not typically going to university. We want to continue this teamwork project and actually expand it and make it so that it's actually just sort of within the core or the fabric of our faculty, where like pretty much every professor has had some sort of EDI training, and sort of when they have a teamwork project in their course, they can manage it in a way that's more inclusive and more equitable for all the students that are involved. And certainly we still want to have training for our faculty, and the Central Equity team at McGill is really good about offering workshops for everyone, but a lot of times you want to have a workshop that has an engineering perspective on it. You want to bring in engineers to talk, like Jackie, people that are out in industry to come in and talk to our faculty about what's needed in the workforce, so that they're educated and they understand what's needed and how they can tailor their courses to address these things. So there's plenty of opportunities. There's a lot of ambitious people within the faculty. Hopefully my replacement in eIdea is going to be identified soon, but I still continue to help out in this initiative because I'm really passionate about it. And at least me personally, I'm taking what I learned being an associate dean working on equity initiatives back to my department of mining and materials engineering to try and bring those initiatives there. And I guess lastly, you know, if you're interested, the university advancement team is is always working to find support for these initiatives. And you can reach out to Cynthia, who's here on the call today, if you're interested in knowing more about eIDEA or supporting us. And there she is.
Yes, I'll put my email in the chat box. If anyone wants to have more questions addressed about this initiative, or if they're interested in self-funding, please feel free to email me and I will get back to you as soon as possible.
Wonderful. I mean, I think, Richard, what you point out is that this work is not side of the desk work. It is indeed core work, and we need to think about it in that way and to make sure that we resource it as a core of what we do. It's vulnerable work as well, but it's critical to achieving the goals that we want to achieve for our students, for McGill, and for the workplaces that we move into subsequently. So thank you, Richard, Jackie, Ada, for sharing your perspectives, and to those who joined us today for this conversation. And I hope it will, be one that will continue, and that you'll also continue, Shirley, to freely to share your thoughts with Cynthia as a follow-on to a conversation. So thank you so much to all, and wishing you a lovely rest of your day.